I'm particularly happy about this book being out in the world, because it was one of those books I intended this book to knock this off and knock it out in a couple of years, and instead it took 10 years. And you know, I was doing other things at the same time. I published a book of poems and a book of essays and so on. But it just became kind of an epic sprawl, the effort, which was kind of, in a way, accidental. I'm a poet primarily, and whatever that means, but because I do an awful lot of different kinds of writing. But fiction seems to be this kind of, you know, it's an accumulation. And I wrote one collection of stories, Chelsea Girls, that I published in the 90s. And after each book of fiction, I've had a particular feeling. And after the first book of fiction, after Chelsea Girls came out, I felt a little despair about, you know, writing another book of fiction, because it actually did take, that one also took a long time, mostly out of a sense, I'd write a story a year, kind of, and think, all right, maybe I'll wait for the next good idea to come. And after that one, I felt a little mild despair, and so I thought, well, maybe I'll just write a list of the stories I would write if I could write stories, you know? So I wrote that list, and then I plucked one story off the list and thought, well, why don't I just pretend to be writing this story? And I began it, and as I began it, I had this other thought. I thought maybe a novel is just all these stories shuffled into each other. And then I sort of proceeded with that as my guide. And all those stories in that next book, which was called Cool for You, were about the female experience of being inside of institutions. And it seemed like, at least in the conversations I heard about literature, it often seemed like there was this idea about the male outsider, you know? And I felt even part of the world that talked that way about literature, and yet I felt like, as a female writer, I felt like I was kind of an insider raging inside of institutions, and that I wanted to write that story. So that novel was all those stories, and there was one story that just didn't work. Like when I finish a longish book or finish the first draft, I have like a slightly changing group of friends that I showed this, you know, murky manuscript to. And they all said that there was one narrative in that book that they really just couldn't bear, and it was the narrative about being a poet. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm sure it just probably was just something I hadn't figured out yet. And so that narrative basically became this in a way, though I didn't use any of that same material. And also, I think in part as a poet, and very much as a prose writer who, I don't really respect the distinction between fiction and nonfiction. It doesn't seem very important to me, and it seems very unclear. And I just basically jettison it entirely. And one way I do that, for sure, is by using my own name. The narrator of my fictions is always Eileen Myles. And so that's, you know, that's been a problem for some people in publishing, and they'll be like, A, how can you call this fiction if you're using your own name? And also, who is she? You know, because it seems like if you're using your own name, they should either already know who you are, or because of a certain celebrity or a certain anonymity, like you would be the little boy or the little girl who fell down that well 30 years ago, and now this is what happened in her life, you know, so that you can say who that person is. So I thought, well, why don't I just write a book that answers the question of who is she? She is the poet Eileen Myles. I thought I'll write a book about that character, you know. And I tried to, and I felt something that I often thought in writing fiction, which is that if you stuck to the details, more or less. I mean, my feeling about writing is that as soon as you put pen to paper, the fictive process begins. You know, I don't think there's anything very trustworthy about what any of us do expanding in language to give an account of anything, pretty much. And certainly, if you have witnesses to any event, you'll always have people saying that that absolutely is not the way it occurred, whether it was a public or a private event. But there was some other corner to that thought, and I'm not sure what it was. I don't know. Any questions? Yeah, and I also think in the age of, I mean, I as somebody who came up in the 60s and 70s, and I guess when you stopped coming up, but there was in college there was a new journalism thing, you know. There was a kind of an explosion in nonfiction writing, which was to make nonfiction itself as a form be sort of excessive and poetic and expansive, And also there was an explosion in documentary film and video. And so I felt like, as somebody who started to write in that time, it seemed that the active writing was really kind of the active recording or the active reproduction. And again, that we knew all those documentary forms are very untrustworthy too. So that what I finally think of as fiction is the assembling of all those narratives and how you put them together. And the word memoir has always been not very appealing to me because it seems to suggest that there's some precious object that's being preserved. To what end, I'm sort of always wondering, you know, and it just has a sort of a sentimental quality to it, where it seems the novel is still, I mean, at least in the right person's hands, I think the novel is still coming into being, I think. You know, it was sort of a shaggy form in the 18th century, and I don't see why it can't be that in the 21st, especially, I think, as so many people are writing in this other kind of specious genre, which is memoir, and sort of piling all sorts of lives and details into that. It seems like the novel that is sort of living in the same time should be affected by that, you know, and it is. So I feel like I'm kind of merging the two, and also the part where I say poet's novel. You know, by poet I kind of mean the kind of in a way the unsteady hand of the. I mean, I think poetry is sort of a crackpot medium in a way because it comes from the eye and the hand and the moment that we're alive in, you know, and it's sort of like when people say they don't write poetry because they don't know how to read it, I think part of it is that it's irregular, you know, it's sort of, and I think it's irregular because each person who takes this medium up has the right to make the line be that long or that long, and even right next to each other, you know, and I think the people who always are most comfortable with poetry are children and prisoners. You know, because of their relationship to time and their relationship to irregularity. You know, and I think when kids see poetry, they're excited because that way that it occupies the space only partially sort of implies play. You know, and it implies song, and it implies, I mean, like when I first started to read, I remember, you know, my mother was the recording, my mother would read the text, and we would look at the pictures, and there was this great feeling of intimacy, and eventually we started repeating the text with her, and then started kind of attaching what we read to the looks of those words. And eventually those pictures started to vanish, and finally the page was full from the West Coast to the East Coast of the page. You know, so that when I became a reader and saw poetry and saw its partialness, I thought, hooray, there's a weird looking page here, and it must mean something else, you know, and wanted to be one of those people who wrote in that language of the weird page. So I wanted to bring that into the novel too, you know, to say this is a poet's novel and I'm writing it in this kind of partial way, which is to say that I don't deliver a good, thorough, even adult narrative that will take you up and take you down and, you know, and kind of give you the experience that you may have bought a book for, you know. I guess I perhaps suggest that poets do betray, you know, and betray what? You know, betray something else and other desires, and this book is sort of all out there in a way. So I think that's enough from me for right now. But so this book. So I hang my Inferno. I hang my poet novel on Dante, obviously, and part of the reason for that is just accidental because when I went to college, I had kind of an amazingly hot and college professor, and I had just gone to Catholic schools, and it was so exciting to be taught by this complete other kind of woman, you know. And she taught us world literature, and she suggested we read the Inferno, and not suggested, she commanded we read the Inferno, and that we then go write one. And I thought that meant write a poem, which everybody else in the class didn't think, and I was humiliated by my you know, sort of Catholic school creative project of writing a poem. And then she read it to the class, and it was sort of the Dante-esque kind of experience. So that one story, I wrote that one story first, and then piled other kinds of experiences on top of it. And there's more I can say about that, and maybe I'll say that after I read. But basically, I followed Dante in loose, tiny ways and bigger ways, but mainly the first 100 pages is the hell of being a female poet and coming to New York in the 70s, and to describe that career and to describe that narrative. And then the second 100 pages is Purgatory, which is the career of the poet. and it takes the form of a grant application. And proposing to an imaginary foundation called the Ferdinand Foundation, which asks the poet to give her career narrative, And the one thing worth saying about that is that I kind of had a desire to write something in third person, but I'm not really interested in third person, and I would keep, thinking, what could be the third person of this book? And when I realized that grants are the third person of I, because you're creating this person that is there to please, and though this person does not aim to please, she aims to, rebel against the grant application, I guess. And the third section is heaven, and for me, heaven was how to write a poem, and then also how to be a lesbian. So I kind of have a bait and switch there, because for the lesbians who buy this book excitedly, they'll be hearing all about poetry, and for the poets, they'll be hearing all about lesbianity. So there's a bait and switch in here. So I'm going to read a little piece from, I'm going to read a bit from the grant application. No, actually, I'm going to read a bit from the hell part of being a young poet, and then I'll cut to the grant application.